know what your young boys are doing behind closed doors? They could be doing drugs, smoking marijuana cigarettes, or worse.
Hello, I'm Father Peter Gryp. I'm here to warn you about a blight that is darkening the souls and the palms of the young boys in our community. I am referring to the masturbation menace that is tricking our young children into doing the one-handed dance with the devil himself. Come, take a walk with me. Many parents ask me, what are some of the warning signs that their young boy is in the tight grip of sin? Sometimes that may be difficult to be certain of. But here are a few warning signs that should arouse your suspicion. Does your son come to the breakfast table every morning with shaving cuts on his palms? Does your son have difficulty reading the Bible? Now, not all signs are this obvious, but they are the quickest to come to mind. Concerned parents also ask of the consequences. And no one knows the dangers of masturbation more than Rupert Cummings, who is now blind due to repeated sinful self-abuse.
Rupert was kind enough to share his story with us. He told us a tale of temptation, solitude, and an up and downward spiral he still struggles with to this day. Even when his vision became blurred, his knuckle lust could not be undone. As a man with permanent blindness, Rupert cannot do as many things as he used to, such as feeding himself. Rupert's story is a sad tale indeed, but there are those who did not see the deadly wages of sin until it was far too late. Take the story of Thaddeus Jones. When Thaddeus was walking home from school one day, a strange man approached him in the park. The man offered Thaddeus a pornographic magazine. Thaddeus knew he shouldn't accept the magazine, but by golly, he was curious. That evening, Thaddeus traded his soul for pleasure. And pleasure, they say, comes at a price. One morning, Thaddeus awoke and noticed something about his hands. His palms were covered in thick, curly hair. did everything he possibly could to cover up his sin. But every morning, he awoke wearing the devil's mittens. On one fateful evening, Thaddeus was driving to his grandparents' house with the magazine resting on the passenger seat. The temptation within those crusty pages began to beg for his attention. Soon, young Thaddeus gave into his sinful ways one last time. Not only is masturbation a slight against God, it's the most deadly and dangerous game that you can play with your soul. Don't believe me? Maybe you'll believe him.
Hey everybody, it's Satan, and I've got a free ticket to hell for you. All you need is a bottle of lotion, a box of tissues, and just one sinful thought of a naked lady. So, step right up, don't be shy, bring your blind eyes and your hairy palms, because we are on a highway to hell.